You thought you had an idea of how things were going to turn out, but most of the time you didn't. It's kind of a gambling sort of thing. You have an idea of something that might work. And if nobody's ever done it before, you think, this is a great idea, and you start going down that path. And you might realize right away that, no, that's not going to work, but it may send you off in a totally different direction that you never expected.
Welcome to Not in a Huff with Jackson Huff, where we interview newsmakers, storytellers, and all-around interesting people. Sit back, relax, unless you're driving, and enjoy the show. Here's Jackson.
Hello. I am Jackson Huff. This is Not in a Huff. Thanks so much for joining me. As always, really appreciate it. This week, speaking with another return guest. I'm speaking with Brock Meier. Now, if you remember, I spoke with him about 7 months ago, and really amazing guy. He was somebody whose friends and family had called the most interesting man in the world. So somebody like that, of course, you got to talk to again. The first time we spoke, we talked about his book, The Stonecutter, that talked all about an ancient civilization called Nebatea. We talked a little bit about his career in the lab. We talked about his meeting of his second wife, where he met her online. And after 3 weeks, I think he asked her to marry him. So we definitely had a really fun conversation. And he had so much to share that when he reached back out and said, "Hey, would you be interested in having me back to cover some of the things that we didn't?" I thought, yeah, we certainly should talk again. The most interesting man in the world deserves a second part. This week, we're going to talk a lot more about his career, all about working in the laboratory, all about working with laser and infrared technology, something that he was involved in kind of in the early days in the 1970s when not a lot was known. And then when he retired just a few years ago, almost 50 years later, the things that we do and the way that we use infrared technology, laser technology is huge. I think that we've pretty much mapped out all the unknown parts of the world just from that technology. So he's going to talk a little bit about the things that he's done. Some of it is top secret and we couldn't really get into, but I think you're going to enjoy it. We do get a little bit into the weeds, but not too bad. I did try to keep it in layman's terms, so to speak. So I think you're going to enjoy that part. For me, as a non-science person, I was able to understand, but the second part of our conversation I enjoyed even more when we talked about him being an exotic winemaker. So from science to the science of making wine, certainly a really cool conversation. He makes exotic wine. Now, what does that mean? That means that he makes wine out of things that aren't traditional, not out of grapes, but out of jalapeños, not out of grapes, but out of he had a mentor that was making basically grass clippings. So really interesting stuff. He's going to talk about kind of the world of wine that's not just made out of grapes and really fun conversation there. We're going to talk a little bit about, hey, is another book ever going to come out? The first time we talked, his wife was urging him to write that next book. So we'll catch up where he is with all of that. I really appreciate Brock joining me again. Here is Brock Meier. Mr. Meier, how are you?
I'm good. How about yourself?
I'm good. If people are listening and think, I feel like I've seen this guy before. I did talk to you, I don't know, about 6 months ago, maybe a little bit longer, but we talked a lot about your book, and I wrote down what it was based on, but I think I've got it wrong. I meant to look it up right before we started. Is it Nebatea? Is that the right word?
That's correct.
Oh,
You got
hey,
it right.
there you go. I remembered. Yeah.
Or some people think of it as being ancient Arabia.
Yeah, which was a really interesting, conversation. I think that hopefully everyone's already listened to that one, but I want you, just for those who haven't heard from you before, Brock, just introduce yourself.
I'm Brock Meier. I worked for about 50 years as a research scientist and engineer. And I had a story to tell in me for a long time. And after I retired, I published my first historical fiction novel.
Mm.
And it hopes to be a series of books, and we'll see. I'm working on the second book now.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you a little bit about that in a little bit, but I want you just summing things up. Hopefully everyone goes back and checks out our last interview. Hopefully they've already picked up your book, but I do want to give you the opportunity just in case, people hadn't, in one question, briefly summarize what that book was about and maybe more importantly for me, why they should have listened to that first interview.
The book is based in first century Nabatea, or ancient Arabia, as I said. It's about a young man who he has some pretty dire things happen in his family of birth. He ends up being abandoned by his father. Another man takes him under his wing, and he becomes, he's kind of on the fast track of the art world in the Middle East, becoming a fine art sculptor. He loses his ability to practice his profession, and he then goes on a what ends up being a worldwide quest to try and resurrect his career.
Yeah, and we go into depth about all of that, several months ago. So people check that out. I want to get to your career and then your winemaking because like I said, last time we talked about your book, briefly about your career. I don't even think we touched winemaking. You did splunking. You talked about how you had married someone after meeting them very quickly. You a lot covered. We even talked about how your daughter called you the most interesting man in the world. So a lot of different things that we just kind of did little snippets on. So I was happy that you reached out and wanted to talk again because I think I asked you one question about your career. I want to go into more in that. So just tell us. I know that it has to do with infrared technology and lasers. The only thing I say, um, obviously, this isn't a science podcast, so let's keep it layman terms a little bit. I don't want anybody's
Sure.
head to explode. You already joked before we started that maybe some things you'd have to shoot me after you told me. So no burn
Right.
after reading type questions. But tell us a little bit about your career.
As I said, I worked for 50 years in research science. I started out working at a place called the Santa Barbara Research Center in California, which at that time, and I don't think they're actually in existence anymore. They were sold off a bunch of different times. It was part of Hughes Aircraft at the time, and they were involved in, I would say they were probably one of the premier companies producing infrared imaging systems. Uh, and just to kind of give you a thumbnail view of what that is, I think probably a lot of people know that infrared is the light, part of the light that we can't see. It is light that has a longer wavelength than the red light that we can see. And it has a lot of interesting properties. Probably one of the most important ones is that you can, if you image it, you can get a thermal image of something. So as you look into a scene, instead of just seeing light areas and dark areas, those objects then give you an indication of what their temperature is. Another thing that they built were infrared radiometer systems that went on to cutting edge satellites. Probably a good thing to throw in here is when I started my career, which was in 1973, there were no personal computers. There were barely even any digital calculators. So a lot of work that was done was still being numerically calculated using slide rules, believe it or not. When I was in my undergraduate work, everything you did was calculation by slide rule. So that kind of gives you an idea of, it was kind of back in the Stone Ages as far as scientific research goes. What else can I say there? Some of the things that we did were, I mentioned radiometers on satellites. radiometers are devices that, while they can image, what they're really about is making very precise measurements of things. So you send a satellite out and you have it orbit around or fly by, let's say, the planet Jupiter, and it's able to take very precise readings on the cloud tops of the atmosphere around Jupiter, things of that sort. Now there are so many satellites flying around up there, it just boggles the imagination. But back then, one of the projects that I worked on was putting together some of the sensors that went on to what was called the thematic mapper, which was in the Landsat series of satellites. And it was involved in making some of the very first measurements of the Earth, where you would look at all kinds of different colors in the visible spectrum and different colors in infrared and ultraviolet. And by comparing all those measurements, for every little pixel in the image, you could perhaps determine what some of the mineral content was on the surface of the Earth, or you could determine what types of plants were growing there and what the health of the plant was. And all this stuff today is just like old hat. But back then, that was one of the very first satellites that was attempted to do that. And it's kind of interesting. I think they probably still do some of this, but a very important thing was to, once you take all these data from orbit with a satellite and you're looking at the data, at least in those beginning years, you didn't know exactly how to build the algorithms that would tell you what those things were on the surface. So then you'd have a ground team go out to exactly those areas where the images were taken, and they would perform measurements of what's called ground truth. So they'd actually determine what minerals were there or what plants were there, and then they could fold that into the database, and you crunch all those numbers, and then you can start to figure out what you're really looking at from space.
So I guess the organization you work with, are you more on the side of developing this technology or more on the side of actually using it and reading the data that came from it?
I've always, throughout my entire career, been what a lot of people call a lab rat. You know, I was always a hands-on, experimental sort of guy. When I first went to work there, my job was growing ultra-high purity semiconductor crystals that were then cut up and used to produce infrared imaging sensors. And it was done kind of like silicon technology is done today for producing microchips for computers and whatnot, cell phones and all that. The same sort of techniques were used. And again, this was in the very beginning days of integrated circuits and that sort of technology. You know, as I said, there weren't any personal computers back then, but there were the beginnings of integrated circuits. So we were making what essentially were integrated circuits, but they were built for making images and light measurements. The crystals that I was making were what's called mercury cadmium telluride. It was an alloy of mercury telluride and cadmium telluride. I think pretty much everybody knows what mercury is, that liquid silvery metal. Cadmium is kind of seen to be a bad actor now. It's a kind of poisonous heavy metal, and tellurium is in the sulfur family. But you put those three things together and produce an ultra-high purity crystal out of it, and it becomes sensitive to infrared light. It's kind of interesting. When I was compounding these crystals, Mercury, because it's a liquid metal, has a very high what's called vapor pressure. So as you heat it up, and you have to heat it up in order to grow this crystal, as it gets heated up, the pressure that it produces becomes very, very high. So we would take these three elements, seal them into a quartz ampule, a quartz tube that was very thick walled because of the high pressures. It was made out of very high purity quartz. It's all sealed off under vacuum, and then it was put into a furnace that shook back and forth. And it took about, I think at that time, like 2 or 3 weeks to grow one of these crystals. It's about the size of a hot dog, I'd say. But because occasionally these things would blow up because of the high pressure, it was right on the edge of being able to get these quartz ampules to hold the pressure or not. So sometimes they would just explode. And we put them into what we called bomb rooms because of the potential for explosion. And occasionally the thing would explode and I'd have to go in there afterwards, and the whole inside of the thing would be splattered with remnants of all these three elements, including mercury. Well, this was back in the days of OSHA had only been active for probably a year or two at that point in time. So today you'd probably be all in a hazmat suit and all that. But in those days, you didn't do that. You were lucky if you had just a mask to put on your face and get in there and clean all that up. But they did check us, like once a year for exposure to heavy metals. And amazingly enough, I never showed positive for any of those elements. So it kind of goes to show you, yeah, these things are poisonous, but a lot of effort is expended today, which is maybe beyond what is really required.
I hear you for sure. So I guess I want to ask you, for those who are listening and you're kind of hearing the nitty gritty, just because of, who people are now, you got to kind of bring things home. And I guess whether you worked on it or not, when it comes to this technology, what's some of the most impactful things that came from it? Why should people care that this even exists? What are some things that have happened because of the type of technology you worked on?
A lot of infrared engineering, as I said, has now to do with a lot of observations from orbit around the Earth. We know so much about what's on the Earth, not only the materials that are there, but in recent years, there's been a lot of effort in archaeology. And I think we talked in the previous episode about a lot of the research that I'd done looking at archaeological reports and whatnot in order to be able to write that novel. Now, a lot of archaeology is conducted by looking at space images. A lot of things have been discovered that nobody had any idea that it was there. So that's one thing, is just knowing what's on the Earth itself. Another thing, which is, it hasn't really hit the automotive market much, but you can, if you want to spend quite a bit of money, you can outfit your vehicle with a thermal imaging system, and it can be displayed on your windshield at night. So you can see out in the distance, beyond the reach of your headlights, if there's a deer on the side of the road or a pedestrian, things of that sort. Another thing that has just hit the news recently over the last, I would say year or so, year and a half maybe, is the James Webb Space Telescope. It primarily operates in the infrared region of light. And because of the long wavelengths that it uses, it is able to look into areas of the universe we haven't been able to see before, because the visible light is obstructed by dust and dust and gas in the Milky Way. So by looking at longer wavelengths, you can penetrate through some of that and then also see cooler objects out in space that weren't able to be seen by the Hubble. So those are probably some of the primary things. But in medical science as well, infrared imaging is used a lot to because of its ability to look at fine details and differences of temperature. It can discover tumors in the body and things like that you can't really see any other way.
How did you had a 50 plus year career in this world. How did you get involved in it? Did you kind of, I don't know how long this kind of technology has been around, whether it was kind of in its infancy back then, or was already well developed? How did you get involved in it? Did you stumble upon it? Have you always had an interest and work towards that, or talk about that?
Not really. I kind of stumbled into it. My primary interest when I was going to college was to, if I got the degree now, it was in metallurgical engineering. And if I got the same degree now and taking the same courses I took then, it would probably be called material science. And my aim at getting that degree was really to go into growing silicon crystals, which were used then and are still used now for producing integrated circuits, microelectronic circuits for microchips and things of that sort. That really attracted me, being able to grow high purity crystals. So I didn't end up in the silicon world, but my brother-in-law, who worked at Santa Barbara Research Center, let me know that there was a position available there and would I be interested. And even though it wasn't really what I was primarily interested in, I thought, well, who knows, I'll move out to California and see what it's like. And in short order, I found out that it was probably ended up being much more fascinating of a career than had I just gone into growing silicon crystals. So that's how I got involved in the whole infrared end of things.
Yeah, and I've talked to people in science fields before, in criminal justice fields and forensic science, all these different things, and people that have had long careers in that world. And I always like to ask the question, when do you think it was the best time? Do you feel like if you would have gotten involved now, you were just starting your career, maybe it would have been easier because, hey, a lot more advancements have happened, but there's something to be said too of, I guess, creating those advancements and learning about these things. So are you glad that you started in the early 70s when things were relatively kind of new and you guys got to learn about it, or are you saying not? It would have been a lot easier to start in 2025 when all the stuff was already figured out and we're just kind of using it. How do you feel about that?
Well, probably any time you jump into research, it's going to be pretty fascinating. But yeah, I love the time that I started. We were doing things that nobody had ever done before. So it was all brand new stuff. And every day you could go into the lab and never really know what to expect. You thought you had an idea of how things were going to turn out, but most of the time you didn't. So it was very much, it's kind of a gambling sort of thing, the whole research end of life. You have an idea of something that might work. And if nobody's ever done it before, you think, this is a great idea, and you start going down that path. And you might realize right away that, no, that's not going to work, but it may send you off in a totally different direction of something that does pan out that you never expected. So to me, it's always been a very fascinating thing. And really, every part of my career has been of that sort. It's been where I've been able to do things that, only a handful of people in the world have been privy to at that time, or maybe even after. They had to learn from what you did. So it's been pretty interesting. Yeah, I think the fact that, I started doing calculations with a slide rule, and at the end of my career, I had a pretty powerful computer at my beck and call, and it was really pretty priceless to be able to watch that whole transition.
No, I hear you for sure. So what do you, I mean, you obviously you've retired from that world, and we already talked about you becoming an author. So I guess what about being involved in that kind of thing? And maybe this is a tough question because it's hard to say exactly everything that you've done, but what do you miss the most about kind of being still involved in the labs and things like that?
I think the main thing, beyond what I already mentioned about learning things and exploring in areas that people have never looked into before, I think the main thing is the camaraderie of research. I don't think people that haven't worked in a lab don't really realize that. Maybe the best thing, and this is maybe kind of a stretch, but I'll use it as an analogy. People that are have lived much of their lives in the military, there's a camaraderie that goes on there. You all have to work together in order to accomplish your mission. And in a research lab, it's very much the same thing. I was a hands-on guy doing experiments, but I worked very closely with a lot of people who were more on the theoretical end, and they maybe didn't have the skills and abilities that I had to actually hands-on work in the lab, but they would generate these wild, crazy experiments, and you think, wow, I don't know, that's a pretty crazy idea. I have no idea what's going to happen with that. But then you go in the lab and start putting things together, and it's really challenging as an experimentalist. Then you have to figure out how to set up an experiment in order to prove or disprove what the theory was. So that in itself is a very challenging, really a creative process. I think a lot of people think that science and technology is kind of it's an analytical thing, and it is that, but it's kind of plug and crank, and out comes the answer, and so what? But at least my experience has been very different than that. Though there's a lot of analytical things involved, to me, the really precious and priceless part of the whole thing was the creativity of it. All the way from the guy who's generating the theory, because he's just pulling these ideas out of where the sun don't shine sometimes. And, when you go into the lab to set up an experiment that's never been tried before, you may have to invent instruments and devices that have never been built before. You can maybe go online and find a few components here and there, but some of the stuff even you may have to go to a guy in a machine shop and have something milled or turned on a lathe to be able to make something to make this experiment happen. So it's a very creative process that maybe it's not quite like painting a picture or sculpting, but it's kind of in the same category where you really have to be thinking out of the box.
Yeah, and there's jobs out there that basically you can clock out and leave it behind, and there's jobs that are all consuming. Obviously, if you're work at a department store, you're a taxi cab driver. When you get home, you're not really thinking too much about that. I'm sure. So when it comes to this kind of world and developing these experiments and all that kind of stuff, how much of your life, in these last 50 years before you retired, how much of it was your job kind of an all-consuming thing? Were you able to leave things behind, or was it something that has kind of took up your headspace for 50 years?
Well, for me personally, I never had that problem of leaving it behind. I knew a lot of guys that weren't in that situation. They'd go home and worry about it and dream about it at night and come in with some new idea and all that. But for whatever reason, that never worked that way with me. When I left the lab, that was basically the end of it until I got back in the next morning. And it's kind of funny. I never even dreamed about work or anything like that. It was even rare that I would talk about it with people that I knew at work, outside in a more social sort of atmosphere. We rarely talked shop. And it's really kind of funny. In the 2 or so years now that I've been retired, I've probably dreamt about my research career way more in those 2 years than I ever did in all those 50 years put together when I was actually working.
Yeah, well, that is
So,
funny. So now,
I think that's just my personal bent.
yeah, no, for sure. I think it just depends on it. Everyone's a little different, but I'm sure just for your own sanity, it's good that you were able to leave that behind for sure. So I want to kind of now move into the next area. We've got people's head spinning all about science, so let's kind of get them spinning in a different way. I guess when it comes to maybe getting a little bit buzzed, because I want to talk about
Okay.
your. I guess you got into the world of winemaking. I think you said about 14
All
years
right.
ago. How did that
All
happen?
right. My mom and my dad had made wine for quite a few years. And I think he started that right after he retired. And they just were looking for something fun to do together. So they started making wine. And I always thought that was kind of interesting that he did that. But I'd never really drank that much wine. I mean, some here and there, but I was not a wine guy by any stretch of the imagination. And every time I'd talk to him, he'd tell me about the different wine batches they're making and all that. And one time when they were visiting us down in Texas, there was a local, I lived in a fairly small town at the time. They had like a pioneer day where they have a conservation plaza with a lot of old buildings that they've rescued and stuff like that. And once a year, they have people get together and make soap, and they have a blacksmith there and all that. So we went down there, and in the back of one of these houses out in the backyard, there was a guy with a little card table, and he had some homemade wine. And I said, hey, here's a guy that's got some wine. Let's try it out. See what you think about his homemade wine. And it was made out of a local berry called an agarita berry that just grows wild down here in Texas. So we tasted it, and it was really good. Well, I didn't really think that much more about it until, maybe 3 or 4 years later. And for whatever reason, I just thought, that was kind of interesting. My parents have been making wine all these years. I might be interested in looking into that more. So I emailed my dad and I said, and I told him this story, reminded him of the story that I just told you about this agarita berry wine. And I said, where I live now, I actually have agarita growing on my property, and I'd like to try making some wine out of it. And he said, oh, yeah, I do remember that. And I said, I need a recipe. And my dad, at the age of, he was probably 88 at that time. My dad had always been an internet guy from the very beginning of personal computers and the internet. He was on there checking things out. So I said, oh, yeah, I'll get on the internet and I'll find you some recipes. So the next morning, he had 2 different recipes for agarita berry wine. So I thought that was great. So anyway, I ended up making the wine according to the recipe and all that. And I thought, I'd like to do this again. So I asked him where he got the recipe, and he said, oh, this is a great site. This guy has a wine blog for home winemakers, and you can find, there's like hundreds of recipes there. So I went to the wine blog. The guy that did the wine blog has passed away now, but he was an incredible writer, fascinating guy. And he had all these recipes on there, but I loved following his blog and just all the things that he had to say. Well, over the next probably 4 or 5 months of checking this out, it turns out this guy was like the world's treasure for home winemakers, telling them how to make wine. And I kept thinking to myself, Jack Keller, where do I know that name? Well, finally on the website, after I'd been on it for months, I saw a picture of the guy. I realized I worked in the same building with this guy and had rubbed elbows with him, standing shoulder to shoulder in the men's room at the urinals. And, I didn't really know him well, but we'd carry on small talk and all that. And so I contacted him and said, hey, I actually know you. My dad turned me on to you, and I know you. So anyway, through that, I just really started getting more and more fascinated with it. And what he did, Jack Keller, as well as my dad, and what I do, is make what I refer to as exotic wines, non-grape wines. Use anything but grapes. Jack Keller was like the world's evangelist for widening the spectrum of what you can make in wine. It's kind of like, I don't think he ever used this analogy, but I do. It's kind of like making wine from only grapes is kind of, if you're going to paint a picture, you're limiting yourself to only the color blue or whatever. And there's a whole spectrum of things out there you can make wine with. So I find it just incredibly fascinating to, from scratch, ferment botanical things, whether they be fruits or whatever they might be. And it's kind of like farming in a bottle. You're growing something in there. It's a living organism that is changing your raw ingredients into something that can turn out to be quite remarkable. So it's kind of a long story, but that's more or less how I got into it. To give you just an idea of what exotic wines can be about, this is a very strange thing that I ran across on Jack Keller's blog. He had entered a wine competition, and he won first, second, and third place. Well, here are the wines that he won with. All the other wines pretty much were grape wines. The best of show wine that he won with was a jalapeno wine. The second place that he won with was, and yes, this is actually what I'm saying, a grass burr wine. You know what a grass burr is? You walk around in your backyard without shoes on and your bare feet, and you step on burrs, and you get one in your foot. You know what I'm talking about?
That's what it is?
You ever done that?
Yeah.
That's what he made his second place wine out of.
Huh.
Out of grass burrs. The third place wine that he won with was and this is really what I'm saying, a Bermuda grass clipping wine. He was part of a wine guild in San Antonio, and they'd meet like once a month. And he would constantly be talking about how if you really know what you're doing and you balance the wine right, you can make a very good wine out of almost any botanical that's out there, as long as it's not poisonous. And there was one guy in the group that just got tired of him saying that, a guy that only made grape wines. He said he came in one day to one of the club meetings with a big black trash bag, and he threw it in Jack's lap, and he said, "Okay, smartass, make wine out of this." So he opened it up, and the guy had raked up grass clippings off of his lawn.
Mm.
So Jack took that as a challenge and made a wine that won third place in a wine competition.
Yeah, when you said, exotic things outside of grapes, I was envisioning, blackberries and pears and raspberries and things like that. I had no idea it would be things as exotic as you're mentioning. Or is it truly just completely those type of things? Just because I mean, if I'm drinking wine, I don't really like super dry wines. So generally, like the fruit wines are the sweeter ones. But it almost
They
seems like,
can be.
yeah. So the raspberries or whatever, normally, if you look, maybe there's still some grape blend to it. Is it truly grapes are completely out of the picture with these things? He's
Well,
really making it all out of grass.
yeah, well, it depends. It depends on what you're starting with. A lot of times, some of the more exotic things aren't purely that. They may have a grape base. Like for some of the things that I make, I use I used to be able to get this all the time, but I haven't found it for a couple of years now, and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do. But you used to be able to go to the frozen food section of your grocery store and buy like frozen concentrated fruit juices, like orange juice and grape juice. We used to be able to get a white grape juice that was made out of Niagara grapes. And it was a very neutral flavor and aroma. So you could use that kind of as a canvas that you're going to paint all these other flavors and aromas onto. One of the things about grapes, this is why grapes have been used for making wine for thousands of years, and that's that grapes are really the perfect fruit. They have way more sugar than any other fruit. I don't think there's another fruit that hardly compares with them. They can have like 20 to 24% sugar. Most fruits that you'll buy in the store, like a peach or something like that, are down at 10% or less. Most fruits are probably somewhere between 5 and 10%. So it's difficult to make a good high quality wine because you can't end up with enough alcohol from that amount of sugar. So generally for those types of fruits, you're going to have to add some sugar, which is not a problem. Sugar is sugar. Once it's dissolved and in there, you don't know the difference. But that's part of the reason that grapes have always been used. High sugar content, they have a reasonably high acid blend content for good propagation of the yeast cells, which are what are used for fermenting the sugar into alcohol. Yeast thrive in a fairly high acidic environment. So a lot of fruits don't have enough acid. So you may need to add some acid components as well. Grapes also have a lot of tannins, which add a lot of body and structure. So there's a lot of things that grapes have that really make it the perfect fruit. So it's no wonder why they've always been used. It's kind of like, okay, we can add these other things today. Maybe 2,000 years ago, you couldn't go down to the local grocery store and get raw sugar to add to it to bring up the sugar content. So, it was more, and you couldn't find acid to do that with. So it was, grapes were what you used. But now you can just add a lot of these components fairly easily. So that's why you can take all these other really weird things, and if you balance them in proper ways, you can really make some pretty wonderful A purist would not call them wines. They would, they say a true wine has to be made out of a grape. We'll call those country wines
Hmm.
or fruit wines. But then when you get into some of these other things, like Bermuda grass or sandburrs, things of that sort, you can't even really call them country wines or fruit wines. So that's why I don't know that I've ever heard anybody else use the term, but I use the phrase exotic wines because I think that more captures what they are.
Yeah, and we've talked about some of the interesting things he made wines out of. What are some things that you've I guess been successful at making wine out of, and is there anything that you haven't been successful?
I think the very best wine I've ever made was I made it about 8 years ago, and I've made it since, but it hasn't been quite to that height. It was a cranberry wine, after aging 8 years, I think it is by far the finest wine that I've ever tasted of any type of wine. It was really good. Right now, I have it's waiting to be bottled. Now, this is truly an exotic, weird wine. Uh, my father lived to the age of 102. He died early last year. And while he was in assisted living, one time when we went to visit him, we got talking about different things from long ago. And I said, "Hey, you remember when you came home when I was just a kid and you were really thrilled that you'd found at a candy store in downtown Kansas City some horehound candy because you used to eat it as a kid?" And my dad grew up in like the 20s and 30s. "And you just really liked it." He said, "Oh, yeah, I forgot all about that." I said, "I'll bet I can find some on Amazon and I'll send it to you." So sure enough, we found some on Amazon. We sent it to him. He loved it. Well, after he died last year, I ended up with a great big batch of that candy that was left over. I ended up with about 5 pounds of that candy. So I thought, in honor of my dad, I'm going to try and make a wine out of that horehound candy. It's already got plenty of sugar. That's not a problem. And I don't know if you know what horehound is.
I
It's
don't.
an herb that it grows all over the world now. It's kind of considered an invasive weed, but I think it came from the Mediterranean. It's one of the primary ingredients in Ricola cough drops.
Mm.
It's also a primary ingredient in a lot of root beers, and it's in the mint family. It doesn't really taste like mint, but it's an herb in that family that has a lot of aromatic properties like mints do. So anyway, we'll see how it turns out. I haven't really tasted it yet, so we'll see if it's going to be successful or not.
Yeah.
I've had some wines that have been, when I first tasted them upon bottling, I thought, do I really want to waste storage space and bottles by bottling this up? This is just almost undrinkable.
Mm.
But I've learned pretty early on that a lot of wines that you may give up on early, if you wait around long enough, they can end up being pretty remarkable things. And one that I almost threw away, I can't even remember now which wine that was, but I drank it after a year and I thought, well, I'm not going to throw it away yet. And then another year later, I thought, this seems to be getting better. Another year later, and after about 4 years, I thought, this really is quite good wine. I'm glad that I didn't throw it all away in the beginning. And that's really true of a lot of wines. Some wines are ready to drink right away, but other wines may be almost undrinkable to begin with, but you give them enough time and they may come around.
Does it ever happen the other way around? Something you first bottle, you're like, this is awesome. And then a couple years later, you're like, yeah, it's not so good anymore. Maybe it doesn't last that long. Maybe you've already drank it all, so you've never got to experience it. But does it ever happen
Well,
reverse?
yeah, I've had wines that go through a peak, and they're not quite as good as they were at the peak, but that's not very many. Usually what happens is I drink a little bit, like 6 months after they've been bottled, just to see where it's at. And I taste it and see what it's like. Then I try it again in another 6 months. And usually there's a progression of, as it gets better and better, I find myself uncorking bottles of it more often and drinking it because it's getting really good. And the problem is when it gets to its very peak, or at least you expect it's at the peak, the wine is basically almost gone. And you kick yourself for not, reserving more of those bottles earlier. So I think it's really pretty rare that I've had them on the decline, but that does happen, yeah.
So are these mostly, I guess, they're a different kind of breed of wine, so it's maybe harder to say, but is this something that you, I guess, say that it's dry wines? Because I feel like, again, I could be wrong, but a lot of times the really sweet wines, they kind of are good early. They're not, you don't really find a 8-year-old Moscato or something. Normally the sugars have all broke down by that point, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, that's not totally true.
All right.
I think there are, like you mentioned, Moscato, there are several wines that are meant to be drunk early because that's where they are at their peak, like within a year. A lot of lighter, more fruity wines like that, and generally they're lower alcohol. They may only be like 7% alcohol, and they're meant to be consumed pretty fast. But there are a lot of other wines like ports and sherries that can be quite aged wines that may be 20 years old, kind of like really fine scotches that are aged for a long time. And ports are very sweet. So it really depends upon the very specific wine itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And you do this at home, but I assume that I don't know whether you entered a contest yourself, but I think that you won some kind of award. Tell us about that.
I won an award for a wine label
Oh, label.
a few months ago. Yeah,
So the wine may have tasted terrible, but the label was great.
yeah, there's a magazine, a monthly periodical called Winemakers. I think it's Winemakers Magazine. And they had an article one month about, be sure you send us in some of your wine labels, no cost to enter, just send us labels and we'll, pick the winners out of it. And I didn't win a high, first, second, or third prize, but I did win an honorable mention for my, let's see, that was for Rasputin's Rhapsody, which is it's a dessert wine. It's a sweet wine that's about 17% alcohol. It's a fortified wine. It's raspberry and chocolate on a grape base, a red wine base. And it's one that really ages well.
Do you just, I guess, name each one? Do you have your own like Meier's Vineyard or what?
I call myself, my little production facility here, the Bulverde. Bulverde is the little town that I live in Texas. The Bulverde House of Zymurgy. Zymurgy, you've heard of an enzyme? A zyme is something that breaks down a chemical. And fermentation is an enzymatic process. So zymurgy is usually, that's kind of an old-fashioned term for the art and science of fermentation. So I'm the Bulverde House of Zymurgy.
I like it.
I had a friend of mine who said one time, I know you make wine. I'm kind of interested in that. Could you show me how you do that? So I took him back and showed him, some of the equipment and talked just a little bit about how it all worked. And then he said, hey, could I watch you do this sometime? I said, sure, that'd be a blast. So over the last, I think he started with me about 2 or 3 years ago. I kind of took him on as a student and showed him what I'd always done. And he now is making all of his own batches.
Hmm.
He's really a wine kit guy. I'd never made a wine kit until he and I got involved together. And I told him that there's a lot of different ways for you as a home winemaker to make wine. And I said, they actually make kits of wine that are very highly engineered and very precisely put together. So it's almost like falling off a log. It would be very difficult to make a mistake, and you can come out the end almost assured of having a very good quality wine. So he said, oh yeah, I'd like to try that. So that's really what his forte is. But occasionally we make a batch together. So that's been a lot of fun, having kind of the fellowship of winemaking with another person.
How I guess you said you showed in your whole setup. How big of a setup do you have with all of this? Is it something that you're just doing in the garage? Is it something bigger than that, or?
I do it basically in our kitchen. I guess it's a 1.5 deep by 3 feet wide by 6 feet tall cabinet that I generally put most of my stuff away in that are fermenting or whatever. But I have a great big sink in the kitchen. It's one of those sinks that's like, probably 14, 15 inches deep. And instead of a double sink, it's just a huge one sink. So it makes it very easy to wash big containers and things like that in.
Yeah.
But I basically just do it in my kitchen.
Yeah.
And
Well,
then
that's awesome.
I have my wine storage rack in our master bathroom. That's like the central room of the house, so it's most likely to stay with the best uniform temperature.
Mm.
I would love to have a wine cellar, but I don't, so that's where it all goes. So I've got a floor to ceiling rack that holds, I think, about 160 bottles.
Huh.
And it's in the process of overflowing now.
Yeah.
Because my friend's always wanting to make another batch with me. So I ended up with way more bottles than I can really store. I give a reasonable amount of it away, but I need to start giving more of it away.
Yeah. Well, that's the one bad thing about making alcohol. It's pretty well regulated, so it's not really something you can just start selling at the corner, the
No.
corner of your
And
house.
it's a pretty pricey thing to get into.
Yeah.
Both state and federal certification is quite stiff.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, we talked a lot last time about your wife and meeting her and getting married relatively quickly. I think you were probably at the tail end of your career, if I'm doing my math correctly. When
Right.
you met her, so I would assume that she didn't get too involved with your world of infrared. But has she been able to enjoy this other passion of your winemaking?
Well, because of medical conditions she has, she can't really drink wine.
Uh,
But she encourages me and supports me in the whole thing, so that's great.
yeah. Well, there you go. I'm glad to hear. I want to kind of just in wrapping things up, we talked last time all about this book. You mentioned before we even started that you are kind of working on the next book in that world. I want you to talk
Right.
a little bit about that. And then I remember
Okay.
from last time, um, and maybe it's this second book here, but I remember from last time you talking about how you had other drafts of other stories in cabinets, and your wife was trying to talk you into eventually publishing them. You were at the time resistant. Is that still the case?
Uh, when you refer to the thing that she wants me to publish, that's actually the first book that I wrote.
Okay.
Um, at the time, I had like 3 different blogs on the internet. I think they're actually still out there. They're not active, but I think they're still there. Uh, and I'd written off and on things like that for a long period of time. So I was interested in just polishing up my writing, learning more about writing in general. So I got hooked up with a local writers critique group that met once a week at the local library. And it was a great group of people. When I joined, it was all women, except for me. I think it was 8 women and myself, and then maybe 6 months later, another guy joined. Uh, but I learned a lot there. And I talked with one of the guys as we were leaving one time, and he was just about to finish up writing a novel. And I said, Henry, how long did this take you to write? Now, what was that like? What was your story of writing this novel? And he thought a little bit and he said, oh, I think that took about 10 years. And I thought right then and there, there's no way I have any interest in writing a novel. That's just ridiculous. Spend 10 years of your life writing a novel. So I kind of just threw that out the window. But I had, it's a fascinating story, but it's kind of long, so I won't go into it. I had been given a poem by a woman who is in the group, who is a poet as well as a novelist. And that poem, when I read it, it just emotionally grabbed me and would not let go. I like poetry, but I'm not, deeply a poetry guy. But that poem just wouldn't let go of me. And the only way I could figure out to not think about that poem was to sit down and write about it. It was about a woman who was trying to escape some of the horrible ravages of the Civil War with her 2 young children. She'd just recently been widowed. Her husband had died in the war. So it was a pretty emotional, horrific, dramatic poem. Anyway, I wrote some letters from the guy who died in battle home to his wife, who is the subject of the poem. And I thought that was the end of that. And I emailed it off to my friend and said, look what you did to me. You kept me up at night for like a week. And I finally got rid of it by writing these letters home. And she said, oh, these are great. These are great. Well, I thought that was the end of it. But then that was like on a Saturday. On Monday morning at 3 a.m., I started waking up, and scenes from this story just kept going through my mind. And I thought, oh, they'll be gone after a while. Well, they weren't. Push come to shove. At the end of 6 months, I had written a 128,000-word novel of this woman's life. I was not trying to write a novel, but I was really forced into writing it because that was the only way that I could get rid of these moving scenes, these movies in my mind at 3 o'clock in the morning. I would come home from work. I'd get home about 6 o'clock. We'd have dinner, and about 7:30 or 8 o'clock, I'd go in and start writing until like 11 or 12 o'clock, and then I'd go to bed. And I'd sleep well again until 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'd wake up and have these images again. So that's the book that is still unpublished that my wife has read. She says, oh, you need to publish this. So we'll see. I may publish that at some point. A lot of people in the writing world would caution you about publishing your first novel. Everybody says, don't even think about publishing your first novel. So that's why I've been so hesitant. But we'll see.
Well, who cares what they say? I think if your wife says it's good and other people have looked at it and thought so, then yeah, I think that seems like a silly faux pas that nobody needs to follow. You've talked about it on 2 different episodes of my podcast, Brock. Now you've got to do it. I'm with your wife here.
Well, I'll tell her that you're putting in a good word for the book.
There you go. Well,
it's called A Peculiar Darkness.
Yeah. Well, if it ever does come out, you're going to have to come back and we'll talk more about it.
I'll do that.
Awesome. Well, I want you. Maybe you're hesitant on publishing that, but it doesn't sound like you're as reserved on moving on with the story with Nebatia. So, what's your ideal for that next book?
It's kind of been slowed down. I was hoping to get it published towards the end of this last year, but that didn't happen. Sometimes life just gets in the way of your plans. But I hope to finish it this year and publish it. It's about the life of a woman named Shakilat, who is a real woman who was the second queen of King Haratat IV, who is the king of Nabatea from, I think, 9 BC until 40 AD. He had a really long time being a king. And a lot of those Nabatean kings actually did. But she was the second queen. And there's a lot of intrigue about who she was and other lives of famous people that she may have affected, and her life may have been affected by them as well. Uh, so it's totally unexplored. Part of the thing here is that the Nabateans themselves left no written records. So I have kind of carte blanche to go through and write my own story of what all happened there. So it's her life, which should be interesting.
Yeah, well, more to come with that one for sure. In wrapping things up, Brock, just tell us any connection points, whether you've got, any kind of social media that you want to shout out, you got a website, how people can pick up that first book. Just shout out everything you want to shout out here.
Yeah, two places are pretty easy. One is my website, brockmeierauthor.com, and there you'll find all sorts of things, stuff about the book. I have links to my YouTube channel that I've produced some audio interviews with 9 different characters from the first novel. So the interviewer asks them a bunch of different questions about their life, questions that might come up in reading the book. The questions are answered by them themselves in these audio interviews. So you can check out all that. There's just a lot of different things. You can also, on the website, sign up for my newsletter. It pretends to be once a month, but it's more like every other month. But I have interesting articles that I like to put out to my followers for that. And if you sign up for the newsletter, you can get a free short story that's about one of the characters that shows up in the first book. So it's a story that doesn't exist in the first book. That's the only place you'd get it is as the short story. Then also, if you're just looking to get the book, you can get on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, anywhere you want to go that has books, and just search on The Stonecutter, 3 words. The title of the book, The Stonecutter, and Brock Meier, and it'll come up. Can't miss it.
Yeah, well, I really, really appreciate your time. Thanks again for joining me, Brock.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
That was Brock Meier. Really appreciate him coming and joining me for a second time. Definitely enough to cover. I mean, he's probably got enough to cover even another interview. We'll see if that ever comes to fruition. Definitely if he finally gets that book out that his wife has been telling him to publish, we'll maybe talk to him again. Yeah, I mean, I really, really appreciate him. I had no idea anything about any kind of laser technology, all that kind of stuff. Definitely over my head most of the time, but what I could appreciate is just the amazing things that have came out of this technology. Being able to map remote parts of the world, being able to do a lot of really, really cool stuff. So I appreciate him sharing a little bit about that. And then, if that wasn't enough to completely move into a totally different area, and that is talking about wine and exotic winemaking, that's definitely the area that perked up my ears for sure. I would love to know what some of these wines taste like. I like sweeter wines myself, so I've definitely dabbled in fruit wines as a drinker of them. Definitely never made any, but I've never tried anything this with this interesting of I guess components. So could be a cool thing for sure. And that mentor of his, he's going kind of wild with it, but apparently it works. So appreciate Brock. Appreciate you being here. If this is your first time listening or you haven't already, go leave a 5-star rating on Apple and on Spotify. Leave a written review on Apple. It helps a ton. Follow along on Instagram, on TikTok, all those places. Not Enough Podcast, Not Enough Jackson F on Facebook. Appreciate you, Brock. Appreciate you, the listener. And we'll catch you next week.
This has been Not in a Huff with Jackson Huff. Thank you for listening. Be sure to join us next time, where we will interview another amazing guest who is sure to make you laugh or make you think. Or, hey, maybe even both. But until then, keep being awesome.